Welcome to PWS United, a podcast for the Prader-Willi syndrome community, brought to you by PWSA USA. This podcast gives the latest news in research, advocacy, and family support by bringing together staff, volunteers, PWS treatment specialists, biotech and pharmaceutical representatives, caregivers, family members, and individuals with PWS. Our goal is to share education, awareness, and resources with those living with PWS and their supporters. Join us in our mission to enhance the quality of life and empower those affected by Prader-Willi syndrome.
Homeschooling is not for everyone. It tends to require a certain level of patience, organization, creativity, dedication, and time. Homeschooling also offers a type of freedom, connection, adaptability, creative outlet, flexibility, and connection with your child. This is Annie, by the way, co-host of this podcast alongside Carrie, who we'll hear from later. I have homeschooled my oldest daughter on a sailboat in the Bahamas, where the science lesson was strapping on a mask and snorkel and going swimming in the beautiful ocean and later documenting all the cool creatures we saw with whatever art supplies we had on board. I've also homeschooled at the kitchen table, both of us awash in frustration amid scattered numbers and equation symbols. And though we had those moments of frustration, sometimes tears, most of it was a beautiful experience, a blessing really, to witness the moment when the learning clicks and your child's eyes light up with newfound knowledge and skill, or to see them dive passionately and voraciously into something you have brought them to learn. But that is not everyone's story. I'm speaking of homeschooling my oldest, who did not have Prader-Willi syndrome. And when her little sister came along, and with that the challenges and navigations of PWS, and then her little sister just 16 months later, I felt I no longer had the skills or the patience to do so. But our guest today, Julie Casey, PWSA parent mentor, volunteer, and PWS mom, had a different experience. When her son Ryan, who is 22 and living with PWS, entered school, she quickly realized that homeschooling was the right choice for them. The intention of this episode is to shed light on the topic and share one family's personal experience of homeschooling with PWS. In this, and please remember to check the show notes for resources, we offer information so that families in our community of all configurations, and Julie gets into that, can make informed choices about how their children with PWS are educated. This episode is full of information on how to decide if homeschooling is the right decision or something you'd like to try, the different ways to homeschool, how to find credible information, curriculum, and resources, what it looks like to receive services, and how to build a homeschooling community. It is packed full of information, anecdotes, and perhaps inspiration to get you started. Homeschooling is not for everyone, but it just might be for your family. So let's get into it. Well, Carrie and I are here with Julie Casey, who is mom to Ryan living with PWS. And Julie has many talents. She is one of our PWSA mentors, and she's a volunteer on our work group. And she also is a homeschooling mom. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So I kind of gave you a little intro, but Julie, do you want to just introduce yourself?
So I'm actually a homeschooling alumni, I guess you would call it, because Ryan has graduated. So I homeschooled Ryan from first grade through high school, through graduating high school. And I'm still involved in my homeschooling community. So that's why I said that I would be willing to come and talk to you all about homeschooling.
And we greatly appreciate that. It's a huge help. It's, I think, a topic that at PWSA we try to put as many resources as we can about. It's always part of our school success toolkit when we, put that back out in the world. And we're so grateful that you are willing to talk about this specific subject with us. So
Yeah. I see it a lot in the chat groups.
Hmm.
People will ask, "Oh, is anybody homeschooling? How do you do it?" Or just the frustrations that they feel with the school district. And so people will, including myself, will say, "Have you ever considered homeschooling?"
Yeah.
Because it can be a great alternative for the right child for the right family.
Right. So I think to dive right in here, why did you specifically decide to homeschool Ryan? And then what part did the PWS diagnosis play into that decision to start homeschooling?
So that's a great question because I never thought that I would be a homeschooling mom. That was not on my radar.
Oh,
I know
wow.
there's some people who when they have kids, that's their goal, that's their plan, that's what they're going to do. That was not part of my plan. Just like PWS was not part of my plan when having a child, right? So he went to our public preschool through the early intervention program. Well, actually that would be through the early intervention. But when he graduated from the early intervention program at 3, they push you off to the school district. He went to our special ed preschool through the school district. That was going fine. When it came time for kindergarten, they wanted to put him in a special day class. And I have nothing against special day classes. That is the appropriate placement for some children, for some PWS children, for some non PWS children. It was not the appropriate placement for my child at that time, which is what I said. And that started basically a year-long battle with my school district. So he went to kindergarten. I got my desire, and he was in a regular classroom, but we battled the entire year over various things. So I spent half the year battling the school district, and I spent the other half researching my options. I looked at private schools, which are wildly expensive, even for kindergarten, can be. I looked at various public charter schools that had, like smaller class sizes or, are more flexible or whatever. I looked at homeschooling options and ultimately we ended in homeschooling. So that's how it came about. It came about because my school district was really uncooperative and not meeting Ryan's needs. So that's how it came to be. So that's why when I hear other families that are having these battles with their school district, I just think, I know a way out that
Yeah.
and again, it does not work. I want to be really clear that homeschooling is not for everyone.
Hmm.
We were in a position where because I was a stay-at-home mom, it worked for our family. I was nervous. I wasn't a teacher. I didn't know what I was doing. I just did a lot of research on it. And I also want to say that just because I'm a stay-at-home mom doesn't mean you have to be a stay-at-home mom or have a stay-at-home parent to homeschool. Anybody can. It just might take a little more flexibility.
Well, I want to step in for a second because as you know, Julie, I homeschooled my oldest. So I kind of came at it a different way. I had my oldest and we had a lifestyle of kind of traveling and living out in the hills. And I said, well, the only way to do this is to homeschool. And so I
Right.
homeschooled her through fourth grade. And then we had Freya. And shortly after we had Freya, we had Rona. So then all of a sudden I had two little ones. And
Right.
then I was like, oh, I can't do the. And then, of course, like PWS, And so that's why we sent our oldest to school. And then we found out that we all loved it.
Yeah.
So it was really nice. I did homeschool Freya and Rona. I did, well, I don't know if you could say homeschool, but I did like preschool. They never
Yeah.
did preschool. I did all that stuff with them because I really enjoyed all of that activities. But for us, it just got to a point where I couldn't do it anymore. And we thankfully had a really great option in a public charter school.
Right.
So it was like that small school, Waldorf inspired, but we didn't have to pay Waldorf prices because
Right. I think it's, as a mentor, I often get asked about what happens when they get to school age. And I always tell parents, new parents, I can name any educational setting or option that there is. I can find you a family who's doing that in the world of PWS. So it's like, it really just comes down to what works for your family and your child. There's no, right or wrong answer. It's just what's going to be the best for your child. And it worked out. You asked about the PWS diagnosis being how that influenced. I mean, it did in the fact that I probably wouldn't have had the battles with the school that led me to homeschooling if he didn't have, special needs. It was the special needs and the arguing about that and trying to provide him with the proper supports in the proper classroom that led me to homeschooling. And then, now I'm just like this huge advocate of homeschooling. I really, even though I say that you have to find what's right for your child, I'm a huge advocate of homeschooling because I really just think it's a wonderful way to do it if you can. I could go off on the history of education and how our public schools and even our private schools, right? Private schools are really just public schools under usually a church umbrella, not necessarily, but often private schools are church related. Their whole purpose is to put out little worker bees.
Hmm.
And that's why we started education like this. Like, if you look at the history of the world, education was not in a classroom all day long,
Right.
9 or 10 months of the year. You learned a trade at your mother or father's side or apprenticed with, some other trade or whatever. And then the Industrial Revolution came along and we needed worker bees. And now, if you look at our world, we're changing back to things are very different. Like, not everybody goes to college. People are going to trade schools. People are entrepreneurs. People are social media influencers. We've got all these things. It's like, is our education system really the best? Again, not even special needs, just like any kids. Is this the right format now? I think it served its purpose for a while, maybe not so much anymore, which again makes me this huge advocate of homeschooling in general. We came to really love it. It worked for our family. It gave us, Annie, you were talking about the traveling. It gave us that flexibility too, to like travel when we wanted to. It's great to take vacations when people are not normally taking vacations,
Yeah.
to not have to travel in the summer or
Uh-huh.
spring break when everybody else is having to travel. It's wonderful. We were able to go to museums and the zoo and all these things where you're, out having fun and living your life and still learning. My husband used to tease me because if he would be somewhere with us and I would ask Ryan, well, what about this? What can you tell me about this painting? What can you tell me about this? And Dan's like, everything doesn't have to be learning. I was like, yeah, it does. I was like, yes, it
It's a
does.
great opportunity.
You're
Uh-huh.
right. So I would just throw in reminders or connections to lessons when we were out and about, traveling or, like I said, at a zoo, at a museum, anywhere, because we should all be lifetime learners
Hmm.
and should be taking in our environment and our surroundings and what's happening. And I feel like that homeschooling gives you that better opportunity because you don't necessarily know the details of what your child is learning when they're in a classroom. You might have a curriculum you might kind of know, but I knew intimately what Ryan knew and didn't know. And so it made it really easy to have those conversations about other things and tie them in or fill in gaps because it's like, oh, we haven't covered this, but it kind of fits. So we can, I can use this situation to expand on something we talked about before. So I ended up totally loving homeschooling. Now, we also butted heads sometimes. So it's not all roses and a walk in the
Hmm.
park. It can definitely be challenging and you can butt heads. And we all know that our PWS kids can get very stubborn and very rigid and very argumentative and stuff. And so you have to have some flexibility and some willingness to work with those things as well.
Even with that all being said, you've convinced me. So lots of pros,
Yay!
lots of pros that you listed off. Yeah, that's
There
amazing.
really are. There really are a lot of pros. Now,
Yeah.
there's cons too because you're
Yeah.
with your kid all the time, which can be exhausting.
Mhm.
And like I said, can be a challenge. So it's important to find I always tell people this, to find a homeschooling community because that gives you some support and it gives you other people to talk to, it gives your kid other people to talk to, right? Because one of the number one questions I always get asked when I would tell people, "Oh, I homeschool." "Oh, well, what about socialization? How do they get any socialization?" See, Annie's laughing because she knows,
That is the
right?
biggest question.
It is the
People think that you are homeschooling in a cave
right,
with no one around, like, you're
right.
not going out, that those walls that confine our children in school are the only way they can learn socialization, and
Exactly. And it's crazy. I mean, so I would tell people, I was like, hey, if I took advantage of all the opportunities for socialization in my area and my homeschooling community, we'd never have time for actual learning because there were that many opportunities. For those listening, I live in the Los Angeles area. So, I'm in a big area. There's tons of opportunities. Like I said, there were field trips galore, park days galore. Like I would not be able to teach him reading, writing, math if I was taking advantage of all the opportunities to socialize. The other thing that I would tell people about socialization is what kind of socialization are they getting in school? Because you're sitting in a classroom where you're like, shh, don't talk.
Mhm.
Listen, you get a short little recess, which is often your bathroom break as well. You're not allowed to talk. Lunchtime is you're scarfing down food. You're, again, not a lot of time. So, what kind of socialization are they actually getting in school? Plus, I feel like our kids are more vulnerable and susceptible to bullying and being picked on and
Mm.
learning bad habits and things like that. And so all of those things worried me as well. Like I wasn't comfortable of how the school was going to protect Ryan when it got like kindergarten was only half day in our district. So it kind of worked. He didn't have lunch there because he was home before lunch. Those were other concerns that factored into this as well as the whole battling to get him, proper placement and support. I just wasn't comfortable of him being safe in many, many ways. So bringing him home allowed me to do that and still gave me the opportunity to put him around other kids. We participated in our local park day group. He actually went to homeschooling, like we call them learning centers, where you basically go and you can take a couple of classes. They're in small, like maybe 8 or 10 kids with often either other homeschooling parents who are teaching the class, sometimes homeschooling alumni. There was some older, he took a class from a recent high school homeschool grad. Those were opportunities to, again, be around other kids, to socialize and kind of learn what it's like to stand in line or take your turn or those kind of things without being in an overwhelming environment. Which, if
Yeah.
you can find, is again, some public schools, some private schools also provide that. So if you have that, great. But if you don't, maybe homeschooling is an option for you or something to explore.
Yeah, I was gonna ask Julie, with your specific case, being in LA, like you mentioned, it's such a big, a
Mhm.
massive city. And I know you did your due diligence when you researched everything about what in-school
Right.
setting could look like for Ryan before you made your decision. But I have cousins that grew up in LA, and their class size in high school was like well over
Yeah.
1,000 kids
Yeah.
plus. So getting kind of that more intimate, you can be there and you protect Ryan as needed. Whereas going into like a massive school like
Right.
that, what kind of parameters really could be in place with that many people? I know that's very specific to your
Right.
situation being in that big city. Not everybody would experience that, but
Right.
I'm sure that was well
Oh, yeah.
taken into consideration.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. His kindergarten, unfortunately, the year that he started kindergarten, the class size went up. So I think there were like 30 kids in his kindergarten class. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Again, homeschooling is great. It's a wonderful option. It may or may not be the right option for any one particular family, but I know that lots of people have questions about it, which is why I thought it was
Mhm.
great for us to have a chance to talk and maybe help some people understand. And some people might listen to this and think, yes, that sounds great. I can do that. Some people might listen to this and think, oh, okay, I can't do that. There's no way. And that's
Right.
great because now they have, that information as well.
So I have a few questions around that. One of the things I
Mhm.
wanted to say was that Freya is at a small school, which is really nice. And one of the things that I've learned with her at that school was that I would myself not have been as good of a homeschooler with her. Like she is better at the school
Right.
because I don't have a lot of patience.
Right.
And I learned that with my first one. And I'm really bad at math. I know I'm not allowed to say that, like, especially the movement. It was like, women, no, love math. I don't love math. I'm a poet. I don't like math. I don't get it. I've been telling the school since fourth grade, I can't help with math homework, which
Right.
is when I stopped homeschooling. So I guess the question is, did you ever come up on some situations or some of Ryan's needs, some of his learning needs that you had to seek help for somewhere else, or that you had to maybe learn some skills to help him?
Yeah, I that's a great question because people always feel like, I'm not a teacher. How can I do this? Right? And so I do tell people there are ways to get that support, right? So to answer your question about us, there were times when Ryan might have been struggling on like how do I get this concept across to him? And I would ask other homeschooling moms, I was in Facebook groups and other forums where I could, hear those discussions that people were having. One thing that also helped me is when he was from first to fourth grade, we homeschooled one way, and we'll get into that a little bit later about different ways to homeschool, but we homeschooled one way. And part of that was that he was going to a classroom with a teacher once a week for a couple of hours where they would get some group learning and stuff. And I would help out in the classroom. And math is a weak subject for Ryan, so he can relate to you, Annie. And it's a strong subject for me. So that was one of the areas where we always battled because it was like, objectively, I could understand that it was hard for him and that he struggled, but I couldn't relate to that because I was like, how do you not get this? It seems so simple. Like, because for me, it's like obvious. And so I would struggle with teaching him math because I couldn't relate to, how his brain worked were related to math. And I was really, really struggling with this. Helping out in the classroom made me realize, oh, this is not a PWS thing. Lots of kids are having the same struggles he has. I'm like, this is an age thing. Like, this is just sort of age appropriate. So that helped me have some perspective because Ryan's my only child. So I had nothing else to compare anything to. Having him have those classroom situations for a while really helped me also see what's normal for, the spectrum, because clearly there were kids in that classroom who were really good at math and were firing off the answers, but there were plenty that were like him and went slower at it. And I was like, oh, okay, he's right there in that range, I'm okay. I'm doing okay. But I would get tips again, from first to fourth, we homeschooled through a charter. So we had an assigned teacher and an IEP. So I could ask them for tips, as well as, again, also asking like fellow homeschoolers for tips or reading. I read plenty of books. There are supports for that. There's also a lot of people chose when their kids got older, when they got to subjects that they didn't feel comfortable with, they would find the learning centers or the co-ops so that somebody else was teaching their kid a subject that they weren't strong on or that they battled with their kid about. Maybe their kid didn't want to listen to them on the particular subject. So, homeschooling, again, it doesn't mean you're in a cave and it's just you and your child or children and you never see anybody else. There is a huge homeschooling world out there. And I want to also mention that homeschooling is in some form, every state differs, but it is legal and an option in all 50 states. Sorry if there's any international listeners. I don't know what the international rules are. I know that some countries allow it and some don't. That's the extent of what I know about international homeschooling. But in the United States, it is legal and available in all 50 states.
Well, I know, like in California, you even get when you homeschool through a charter school or through
Hmm.
different program that you actually get a stipend as well to buy supplies. So
Yeah.
that's helpful for families to know. I don't know what other states do that, but
Yeah.
that was always helpful.
Yeah, that very much depends on the charter school you're with. So that option is if you're going through a charter school, that is available in multiple states. There's some charter schools that actually operate in multiple states. So it's like the same school, they have to go by whatever the laws are in that state, of course, but they do cross some state lines. The biggest one, which is actually what we used for the first 4 years, is the K-12 program. So I think they're in like almost all states. And that one, we did not actually get a stipend because they provide you with all the material. So they have their set curriculum. They send it to you every year, a big box of everything, including the paintbrushes and the paint, like for art class, like literally everything you need, the rocks for geology. Other ones, like Annie mentioned, other programs will give you a stipend, and then you have to work with your educational coordinator or teacher. They call them different things depending on which program it is, work with them to get authorized things because you have to, it has to be related to your curriculum and your classes in some way.
You just have to meet
And
the state standards.
exactly. You still have to meet the state standards, and you can't do because those are public schools. It's basically learning at home, but it's still through a public school. You can't use them for religious curriculum. You can still do that, but if you want to do religious curriculum, you'd have to buy that out of your own funds, not out of the funds that they provide you, because that would not be a use of public funds. Again, that's one of those great options for people who need those funds because they can't afford to do it on their own. Those public school charters that provide this stipend are great because some of them will even cover museum memberships so that you can go on field trips and learn that way. So it all depends, but you would work with, again, your learning coordinator, your education coordinator, whatever that particular program is calling the point person.
That's all very interesting because, yeah, coming into this conversation, I really didn't have a ton of really much of any idea of how
Yeah.
homeschooling worked. So I'm so glad that you're covering and letting people know that things are set. Like there's things in place
Yeah.
that will help you get started and you're not just in the dark trying to figure
Yeah.
out how to become a teacher in your home, basically. So yeah, that's also
What
interesting.
What I recommend to people who are exploring that option is, I hate to say Google everything, but it's a good place to start because it's all going to be regulated by your state education department. I don't know because I haven't homeschooled in other states, but I've researched a lot of what the rules are for other states. Most states or a lot of states have a homeschooling organization that's usually pretty helpful in giving you the ABCs, if you will, of how to homeschool. Like the California organization has a great website that breaks down here are your options. And, in California, you can do A, B, or C. If you're going to do A, here's the steps on how you do A. If you're going to go with route B, so find whatever your state is, find the organization, the homeschooling organization for that state, and they will be your best resource, even better than your Department of Education's website, because they'll usually just give you the very legal terminology and here's the code. But your homeschooling organization for your state is going to give you the nitty gritty on how to. Like in California, for example, one of the options is what we call filing a private school affidavit. That's basically when you declare yourself as your own school, you have to file that annually and every once in a while they'll change up the form and do things differently. Our homeschooling organization here in California every year puts out a literally step by step. Here's box 1. This is what they're asking. This is how you fill it out. Here's box 20, which confuses everybody. And here's how you fill that out. Here's really what they're asking. Again, find the organization, like homeschooling organization in Wisconsin, and find that website. And they're going to be a great resource for, how do you do it in that particular state. Usually then they'll have resources listed of like maybe a conference because conferences are really a great way to learn about homeschooling. They're also a great way to look at curriculum. I used to go to the homeschooling conventions. I liked listening to the sessions, but more so to pick my curriculum because they would have these huge vendor halls full of curriculum and full of other resources, field trips, things like that. Because that's another question I used to get asked. Well, how do you find your curriculum? Like, how would you buy your textbooks? And I'm like, oh, let me tell you. And I would pull out this stack of catalogs I had of homeschooling curriculum. And they're like, oh, I had no idea. I'm like, exactly. But yeah, there's no shortage of available curriculum. Which is, again, also great because in public schools, you're forced with whatever that school is using, which may not be the way your child learns. One of the things I enjoyed about homeschooling was I could pick curriculum that matched Ryan's learning styles. And there's I'll plug a book. It's actually probably a website now. It's Kathy Duffy, this book, and it's old. It is 100 Top Picks for Homeschool Curriculum. And she has a website. I like to look at books sometimes to I feel it's easier to flip through pages. But her website, and if you were to search Kathy Duffy Homeschool curriculum, you would find it. But I love her website and I recommend it to everybody because she'll list all these different curriculums. She'll give reviews of them. She's even has a place where it sorts them on the learning styles and parent participation. And like, so they're ranked in all these different ways to help you really zero in on the right curriculum for your student and their style and the time involved and all kinds of things. So that's a really, really great resource when you're looking. So I would always every year, like, take a look at that. So I'd kinda have it narrowed down,
Hmm.
and I would let Ryan actually pick sometimes. Sometimes some things were more hard and fast, but some things I would say, "Okay, I'm looking at this or I'm looking at this." And we'd go to the convention, we'd go into the vendor hall, and we'd go to the booth and, and he could flip through the pages, see, and help pick what he wanted. So it was a great way to get him involved as well, so that they get that buy-in to whatever subject, particularly subjects that maybe they were less interested in. If they're picking the curriculum, well, then, you know, they
Yeah,
have
they're
more of a
more.
vested interest. There's tons in every subject. Every subject you can imagine, there's tons of ways to approach it.
I feel like I just want to make a plug real quick just because you were talking curriculum. Because I did Oak Meadows, which is
Mhm.
a Waldorf curriculum, and it was so fun and it's so creative and it's just really, I mean, you got to really appreciate that style of learning, which comes from Rudolf Steiner. And I believe that he's a questionable person maybe, but his education ideas I just really appreciate, and it's all about, especially in the beginning years, learning through stories, and
Yeah.
math was like, these gnomes that live in the mountain, and they all have their, Patty Plus always is
Yeah.
like filling their pockets, and it was just really fun and really creative, and I think a really interesting way for kids to learn, and something that really inspired that creativity. And it's funny because people used to kind of tease me about homeschooling my oldest daughter, and then sending her to a Waldorf school, and
Mhm.
she's about to graduate with a double major from UC Santa Barbara. So I'm
Yeah.
like, well,
Yeah.
like maybe something worked.
Yeah.
So how did you, during this time when you were homeschooling Ryan, how did you manage your time and your energy and keep from getting burnt out? And you kind of mentioned that a little bit, like you
Yeah.
are with your child all the time.
Yeah. Ryan and I did school. There's different styles of homeschooling too, right? There's a lot of people do what's called unschooling, where it's very child led and it's just like, what's the child interested in? And we're just going to explore those things. I couldn't do that because I'm a very type A, rigid rule follower kind of person. And so is Ryan, right? Like our kids, I feel like need structure.
Mhm.
So, I mean, we had some flexibility. I mean, we had a lot of flexibility, but we really stuck to a structure because I think it's really important, particularly for younger kids. I think all younger kids need structure, and particularly for PWS, I think structure is really important, right? We've seen that in other areas of their life, right? With obviously with food, with just general schedule, routine, structure is really important. So we were very structured, and we did our homeschooling was more like what people call school at home. So we had our basically school hours, if you will, which kind of changed through the years because we got a little more lax and whatever. But I mean, we pretty much had like, we're going to get up, we're going to have breakfast, we're going to get dressed, then we're going to start school and we're going to go. We kind of had an approximate end time, but that was more dependent on how quickly we did lessons that day because sometimes a particular lesson took longer, sometimes they were quicker. We didn't necessarily do every subject every day. It was more, like Tuesdays and Thursdays we do these, and Monday, Wednesday, Friday we do these sort of things. So, our days weren't necessarily all the same. But when we were done, we were also done. We didn't have homework because everything's being done in our lesson. Also gave us the flexibility for therapy appointments, for doctor's appointments, for field trips, things like that, where we would just kind of rearrange. So we were very structured and we had our schedule and our lessons, and we would use a computer calendar that had our lessons all scheduled out. So Ryan had a visual of what he had to do for the day or for the week or whatever that he could look and he could cross off. We also had props around the classroom that would show what the schedule was and where we were. And we used different things and at different ages. So we kept to that structure, which was nice. Oh, and I forgot this, but when he was young, I used a teacher persona And I actually let him pick what he wanted to call me, what he wanted so we used my initials. So I was Mrs. Jack, and he would call me Mrs. Jack while we were in the classroom, while we were learning. And I would, on Monday mornings, I'd be like, "Oh, so Ryan, how was your weekend?" And like act like I didn't know. So we kind of, just to make it fun and like a little different and kind of separate mom from the teacher. We didn't carry that out throughout all of our years. Like I said, we did that for the first few years when he was younger, and just, again, kind of helped him have that break between school versus home. So that's how we did it. Sometimes I needed a break. So sometimes we'd be like, okay, this is not working. We're both too frustrated. And we'd go our separate ways. And, I'd go in the other room and do something I needed to take care of, and let us kind of both cool off. And then we could come back together and do it. We also took When he was younger, I took little activity breaks because, our kids have occupational and physical therapy needs. And so we also had those therapies, but I would work in movement breaks, and they were on the schedule too, of get up and jump.
And then
Or
you could do those things too.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So that it broke down the day a little bit better. So it didn't seem like you're just, because we would be in the class, and we have a room, like our guest room is our guest room slash classroom. And we would be in here not most of the day, because, we'd be done by, I'd say 3 at the latest, but a lot of times it would be earlier, and we didn't start till like 9. We were in here for a good chunk of time, but we'd also do those little breaks. And then if we had something to do, we would just go and do it, and we'd make up our lessons on another day or whatever. But we tried to make it fun, particularly again when he was little, much more so. Obviously things change as they age because their subjects change, their personalities change. You kind of flow with it. Just like even if they were in school, their homework's going to be different when they're in first grade versus 10th grade. That changes. But we did pretty good most of the time. If you need a break, you need a break. And the great thing is you can just take it. The other thing
Mhm.
is, I tell this example a lot because when in high school, we got to a unit in math where it was the compass, right? Where you have to draw the
Mhm.
circles.
Yeah, yeah.
And we probably were doing the protractor and the compass, right? Those usually go together, where you have to make angles and whatever and measure circles. And as you can imagine, somebody with fine motor skill issues, that was a challenge, right? Because he just couldn't physically get the things to do what they're supposed to do. And I was getting so frustrated because, we got to get through this. And then I just took a step back, and I was like, you know what, Ryan? We're just going to skip this unit because I have never used a protractor again in my life, and a compass again in my life, except for like if I'm doing an art project and I want to make a circle. But I've never ever used this for any math purpose. And I know he's not going to use this for any math purpose, because it's not like he's going to be an engineer or an architect or any kind of career that's going to involve this. And so I'm like, this is not a necessary piece of learning. And he looked at me and he was like, can we do that? Can we just, I was like, yeah. I'm like, you don't need this. This is the beauty of homeschooling, right? We're skipping this.
I
Skip
love
that.
that that's your example because we were in Guatemala. We went to Guatemala for a couple weeks in December, and we had to take Freya's schoolwork with her, and that's
Uh,
exactly what she was on, was geometry with the compass and and the
yeah.
angles. And I was just like, why are we doing this on vacation? Like, you're never gonna think, what are we
Right.
doing? Why?
Right. And so
So
we just,
so frustrating.
right. The relief for both of us was just like, okay, great. And then we moved on to the next unit and we were fine, you know? Because it's like, again, that's the beauty of homeschooling is, there are things that you're supposed to do, and each state has their own rules and exactly what you need to cover. But it also boils down to what are your objectives and what are your goals and what are your long-term plans. And I knew that Ryan, wasn't college bound, certainly not 4-year college bound. So that relieved us on some of the math requirements when we got to high school. Cause I looked at those and I was like, oh, okay, we don't need to do 4 years of math. We can do, and I really tailored it to what I think Ryan's going to need. And even some of the math, we did some math where I was like, Ryan, I'm going to be honest with you. I have never used this again, but it is important to kind of know. So we're going to we're going to cover this. We're going to get through it, but you probably will never use this again in your life. We did end up spending a lot more time on really basic everyday math. Literally, we used some workbooks that were called everyday math because I figured that's what's going to be important, right? Can you figure out what your bill is in a restaurant? PWS people might not be going, but they are. They're going to be going out to eat. Can you figure out how to buy something at a store and get the proper change back? How could, those kind of things are much more, that's what we all use every day. We don't use a protractor every day.
Absolutely not. That example in a school
Mhm.
setting, a teacher, because I remember using those actually in class,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
multiple times throughout the, lesson that we're
yeah,
learning, multiple days. And I'm interested if an individual with PWS who, like you said, the fine motor
yeah,
issues, and the teacher maybe is like pushing it and
right.
just and not understanding and just pushing it, and maybe a breakdown could happen. This could
Yeah,
avoid something like that
yeah, absolutely.
coming into play. That
I think,
adaptability, I think, really
right,
sticks with me at least, so
right. And it might be, again, it's going to, Ryan has, on top of PWS, he has dyspraxia. So that really makes his motor planning stuff, both small, fine and large,
Can you
more
define
difficult.
that for people who are listening?
Yeah. So
Praxia.
dyspraxia is a motor planning disorder. I always try to compare it to dyslexia because most people are familiar with what dyslexia is. And like it's the rearrangement of like letters and words, and those are kind of getting jumbled in your head. So dyspraxia is motor movements getting jumbled in your head. So he might see me, I say, raise your right hand, and I can even model raising your right hand, and he'll raise his left hand. Right, because
Mhm.
it just is getting jumbled in his head. So any sort of movements and motor planning is even more, I mean, all of our PWS kids struggle with it to some extent, but he really, really does.
Mm. And it can
And
affect speech, right? Like, it can be
yeah,
like they see a dog and they wanna say dog, but cat is what their mouth
not
says.
necessarily, that's actually a different thing.
Oh, okay.
I don't know, there is a word for that, but I don't know what it is. So Ryan doesn't, that's not an issue with dyspraxia for him. It
Okay.
it does also, though, affect, like, executive functioning and, like, your thought process, but not necessarily word confusion. It's more
Okay.
about just that planning, like, how do I, 'cause so Ryan's weakest subjects in school were math and were writing, just organizing thoughts. And even still, when we're talking, he'll kind of jump around in stories when he's telling stories, or he'll answer a question from a half hour ago. And I'm like, okay, what are we talking about? Which I think a lot of our PWS people do
Yes.
to a certain extent, right? And I'm like, okay. But when he's trying to tell me something, a lot of times he tells it to me in piecemeal, or like, not necessarily in order, and I think that's part of that executive function, like, how do I organize my thoughts to
Mhm.
tell the thought smoothly and completely? So we work a lot on that still, even though he's technically not a student. Obviously, we're still always working on things. But yeah, so dyspraxia really got into that particular math unit, was a
Yeah.
real issue. And yeah, I think that certainly that can be a problem at school. Some of the ways that our kids learn, even with an IEP, can still be challenging because they're still going by whatever that school curriculum is. And in the classroom, they still tend to be very rigid with how they're teaching things, because it's just, well, this is what works for everybody else, or for most of the kids, right? So it depends. Some people might have really great schools, really great teachers, where they are really flexible and they are able to adapt to the individual needs. And that's wonderful. And if you have that, absolutely, that's great. Again, when I hear people talking in the groups about these kind of struggles with their kids, I think, maybe homeschooling's something for you to explore, because it really ended up being a great way for me to customize what worked for Ryan. I mean, I used to tell people this when I pulled him out, because like I said, I shared that we started homeschooling because of battling with the school, because they wanted to put him in a special day class. And I knew that at that point in time, that was not appropriate. I thought, I don't know, 5 years from now, maybe that would be the appropriate place for him. But I knew in kindergarten it wasn't. But he didn't really fit into a regular classroom box, and he didn't really fit into the special education classroom box. So I created my own box. And my box was this huge, big world box where we had the flexibility to do whatever we wanted.
Mm.
and
That's
what,
awesome.
what worked for him.
Mhm.
Because in schools, that is, they're trying to fit you into, because they've got to. I'm not trying to say it's wrong per se. It's just it's out of necessity, right? It is the way it is because when you're trying to educate a huge amount of people with limited resources, you have to kind of do one size fits all. But we are all unique individuals. Again, PWS or not PWS. So there's a lot of people who get maybe not the best education for them because that's just the nature of the public school. And again, probably most private schools as well.
Any kind of mass
System.
education, I think.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Any mass education, just that's the nature of how it is. So homeschooling is a great alternative to customize for your child if you can. Well, I do think that another important thing to mention for our families, because people ask about services, 'cause that's an important thing for our kids, right? What do you do about services when you're homeschooling? So there's a couple ways. One is you can go through your private insurance and have your therapies covered there. Technically, the IDEA Act,
Mhm.
which is your federal, act that covers
The
special education.
IDEA.
Yeah, technically says that public schools have to evaluate even homeschooled kids. And it varies very much across the states, though, and even across districts within states of how they provide services to homeschooled kids. So some will, it won't be an IEP, but like a service plan. So sometimes, depending on your district, you might get some services still through your school district if you're a homeschooled kid. It's usually, again, usually, it might be in your area, but it's usually not the same level that you would get if you were in their school district because they're not obligated to the same level for homeschooled kids. Another way that a lot of people do it is through the charter schools that we talked about earlier, because if you are using a charter school, that is still a public school, which means that you still are entitled to an IEP. So we did do that for those first 4 years so that Ryan did still have an IEP and he was still getting his speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy through our charter school. Sometimes you might have another program like an Easter Seals program or other programs like that that might also help you with therapies. So again, that's going to vary, by what's available in your state or even in your county and your area. But there are ways to still get therapies. So don't let that be a detriment. You also have to, I think, keep in mind a lot of what's in the IEP is very classroom specific and dependent, right? So
Mhm.
a lot of those accommodations you don't need at home because you don't have 20 or 30 other kids in the classroom or even just the breaks, right?
Yeah,
And you
and the
don't need the
breaks.
one-on-one
Mhm.
aid because you are the one-on-one aid.
Yeah.
So a
Mhm.
lot of those things that are in IEPs don't actually need to be done. I would modify stuff for Ryan. Again, when he was little, writing was really hard, right? The physical aspect of writing, which was a battle we had in kindergarten. But when I brought him home, we used little magnetic letter tiles. So he would do his spelling and he would use the magnetic tiles. He knew his letters. But he just physically had a hard time writing them. And then one day he was just like, oh, I think I can write my words now. I was like, great, we'll stop using the little tiles. But that was an issue and something that was in his IEP that I just naturally made an accommodation for at home. And he grew into not needing that accommodation anymore. So it really comes down to like the therapies are the thing that people end up still needing. Do know that there are also ways to still get an IEP, depending on which option you want to choose in your particular state. Again, I was a stay-at-home mom, so obviously that fell on me to do. There are and I could do it during quote unquote normal school hours. If you have two working parents, people are going like, okay, wait, I can't do this. We both work. How would I do this? Nobody says you have to school your child from 9 to 3. Although, actually, side note, I think there are some states where technically they do tell you that. It's broader than that, so it's not 9 to 3. But I think that there are a few states that do have
Time considerations.
time
Yeah.
considerations, but there's still some flexibility there. So it's usually not going to be quite that strict, but
Mhm.
you can have is there a grandparent that could possibly do it? In my homeschooling park day group, we had a few grandmas who they were the ones who brought the kid to park day and to the museums, if, field trips, or they were the ones who dropped them off at the learning centers because they're the ones who had the time. Sometimes we have dads in our homeschooling group because sometimes it's the dad who maybe their job is more flexible, or maybe they're the stay-at-home dad, or the parents do it on the weekend. Again, if your state doesn't restrict you from that, they get their lessons done on the weekends when parents are home, or in the evenings when the parents are home. So it is possible to do with two working parents, or with if you're a single parent who works. There are ways to do it. It just yes, it's harder, but it is
Mhm.
still a possibility. Don't think, "Oh, we both work. I can't do it." If
Mhm.
you really want to, if you really think it's the best thing for your child, there are some ways to do that. You'd have to, again, check with your state's requirements on time constraints and things like that, and see if you have other resources. If you have a parent, a grandparent, or some other relative, or again, there's co ops, there's learning centers where you might be able to drop them off for a good chunk and get stuff done, and then do stuff at home on the weekends or in the evenings. So there are ways. Just
It's all
know
about
there's
being adaptable and creative and flexible, like you said.
absolutely,
That
absolutely.
brings up a question that I have, Julie, is that you can only have one person kind of assigned to be the main person teaching, or can you kind of share the kind of teacher load
Right.
among, you and your partner, your
Yeah.
grandparent, like equally, or does one person specifically have to be the one teaching for the most part?
Again, that's gonna somewhat depend on your state.
Mhm.
As far as I know, there's no restriction on that. There might be, like, for example, here in California, when we homeschooled under the private school affidavit option, I had to list, like, who the administrator is and, like, who the teacher is, which was both me. It also didn't restrict me from, sending him to outside classes. So,
Mm.
generally, one person is gonna be the one who's, like, in charge. And again, for California, we had certain documents that we're supposed to produce if anyone were to come asking. So you're going to have one person who's, like, in charge of
Point
keeping
person.
those
Yeah.
those documents and stuff. What a co-op is a group of parents who just get together and decide, okay, we're going to form like a little pod of learners, and we're going to switch off on who's teaching. Again, it's kind of like that old school,
Mm.
like, village learning,
Yeah, that's
where it's like,
cool.
oh, everybody come to my house and we're going to learn how to, bake. Okay, everybody
And you
come to
can
my
divide
house. And
your
yeah.
strengths,
Yeah,
Yep.
exactly.
of
That's
what you
exactly what it
know
is.
and what you can impart wisdom on and
That's
Exactly.
knowledge,
how
yeah.
that's how we used to do it.
Yeah.
Out in the hills, and we used to
Love
meet at this old
it.
church that was,
Yeah.
like, kinda the old community center or whatever
Right.
out in the
Right.
hills, and it was really cool. Beautiful view, and kids, just
Right.
3-year-old
Oh,
children just running around.
wish I could go back in time,
I
live
feel
with
like
Annie in my childhood.
I know, right? I know. I wish I had been homeschooled because I think I would have
Mhm.
thrived and loved homeschool.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, I feel like co-ops are probably more common in smaller
Mhm.
areas
Mhm.
because, like, here in my area, there's several learning centers, like I said, which are homeschooling families who've decided, oh, hey, I'm going to help out other homeschooling families. And they've created these centers, and some are smaller, some are bigger, where they, have classes, and they have a class schedule,
Mhm.
and, they have the teachers that teach the different subjects, and it's a more organized thing.
Right.
I'm in a high density population, so there's a lot of people and a lot of homeschoolers, so it can support those kind of things. And then I feel like I hear more about the co-ops, which is, very parent-led, smaller in smaller areas because
Mm,
they don't have the learning centers. They both function in very similar ways
sure.
and are great options, again, for socialization, for covering subjects that you're not comfortable with, or that your child maybe has a specialized interest in, or, it's just a great opportunity for expansion.
Mm,
Ryan took
mm,
a cooking class for a number of years, which I know people think,
mm,
oh my
mhm.
God, their PWS kid took a cooking class. It worked. It worked for, again, not necessarily something I would recommend for every PWS family, but it totally worked for us.
And it's
Yeah.
a great way to learn math,
Yeah.
practice fractions.
Yeah.
Measurement.
Fran loves
Yeah.
to cook.
Exactly. And
That is
so,
a cool thing about homeschooling is like, I think that something is good for parents to know that it can sound really overwhelming and kind of daunting. But once you get started and you realize it is like everything
right,
is an opportunity to learn. It doesn't have to, you're not sitting at the table doing worksheets with your
right,
child. That's not what homeschooling is.
right,
Homeschooling is doing the cooking or going out in the garden.
right,
And I remember we used to love, like, going to the beach and, like, writing letters in the sand or finding sticks and, like, just
right,
you get to be really creative and it's really fun, and it's
right.
a yeah.
Exactly. I mean, learning can happen anywhere, anytime. I mean, and if your child, there's some kids who really love doing worksheets. And if they want to do worksheets all
Right.
day, great. If that's their learning style. We did a lot of lessons, video lessons, because Ryan is very visual. And so that was a great way for him to learn. Again, homeschooling gives you that flexibility to find the methods that work for your kid. And also to really dive into one of the things that Ryan struggled with for that year in kindergarten was he really likes learning. He's a really good student, right? Like, likes to learn new stuff. And he would get pulled out of class for the therapies. And he hated that because he didn't
Mhm.
wanna miss out on things, because he hates missing out on things. So, again, once I brought him home, then it was great because we weren't missing anything. Like, "Okay, here's the lessons we're gonna do before we have to go to physical therapy."
Built
Physical
around
therapy. Yeah,
his schedule, built around
exactly,
everything else. Yeah, that's
exactly.
amazing.
He loved, I mean, he'll still tell you about how horrible kindergarten was for being pulled out of, and he's 22.
Mhm.
He was so relieved when because I was doing all my research and, like, visiting schools and stuff while he was in kindergarten, right, for that half day he was in school, and my husband and I talked about it and decided what we were gonna do, and then when I told Ryan, and I can't remember if I told him I think I might have waited until after the school year was done, so I told him, like, in summer that, like, "Okay, well, mom and dad have been looking at other options, and you know how you don't like getting pulled out of class for this, and so we've decided that mom's gonna homeschool you next year because we think that'll be a better way for you to learn. You can learn here, and you won't have to get pulled out of things." He gave me, little 5-year-old Ryan gives me actually, it might have been 6 at the time, get this huge hug, and that's when I was like, "Okay, this was the right decision," because I hadn't really realized how, I mean, I knew he didn't like that, and that was, again, causing battles in the classroom from him being pulled out, but I hadn't realized how heavy that was weighing on him. So when I told him that and he could just see the, like, "Yay," it was just like, "Okay, I've made the right decision," and we never looked back.
Thank you for listening to this episode of PWS United. If you want to learn more about Prader-Willi syndrome and how PWSA USA is making strides in advocacy, family support, and research, visit www.pwsausa.org. And while you're there, we encourage you to sign up for our Pulse email newsletter to stay informed about the latest news, resources, and events. Don't forget to subscribe to the PWS United podcast so you never miss an episode. Our team is always available to support families and their loved ones living with PWS 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. You can call us at 941-312-0400 or email info@pwsausa.org. Catch a new episode next Tuesday, and until then, have a great week.